Hello, Vision Nation. In this episode, we're going to cover Bob Parsons' story. If you've never heard of him, he's the guy who started GoDaddy and then became a billionaire. Now, some people seem like they're born winners. But in Bob's case, before he became rich, no one would have thought that he'd achieve massive success. And it's easy to see why. He had very humble beginnings, growing up poor and even failing a grade in school. But that didn't stop him from starting 2 businesses that made him uber wealthy. His story is so interesting on a lot of levels. I mean, first of all, how does a guy go from failing school to becoming a successful entrepreneur? And on top of that, how does someone with no experience in technology make all that money from tech startups? We'll cover all that in this episode. I think you're really gonna enjoy this one. Alright, let's dive right in. Welcome to Wall Street Vision. This show is on true stories about people making millions. I'm Vlad Dolgochev. This show is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. Full disclaimer in the show notes. So Bob grew up in the 50s in a lower-class blue-collar neighborhood in Baltimore. Now, if you've never been to Baltimore, let's just say it's a rough place. They have way more homicides than your average city, and there's a bunch of grimy and run-down neighborhoods. Now, his family was one of the poorest in the area, and his parents were a regular blue-collar couple with a serious gambling problem. Young Bob was growing up in this environment. You know, the type of situation where you get a set of house keys when you're 3 years old, and peanut butter sandwiches make up most of your meals. It's no surprise that he was also doing terribly in school. You know those silly polls that they do in high school? Like most likely to become a millionaire or most likely to become a pro athlete or whatever? Well, when his school did a poll for the person most likely to succeed in life, Bob wasn't even one of the people listed on the ballot, and that just shows you how much faith his classmates had in his future. They thought Bob's career highlight would be standing behind a deli counter making meatball subs. So what happens to a poor kid with bad grades and no direction in life? Well, he joins the Marines, right? Bob enlisted when he was 17 years old. At the time, he was failing all his high school classes except for gym. But when he showed his teachers that he signed up to serve, they gave him a passing grade. And after completing basic training, he was sent off overseas. I don't know what you guys were like at 17, but the thought of someone handing me a gun and sending me halfway across the world into a combat mission would give me a heart attack. When he got to Vietnam, the landscape was totally different than his seedy Baltimore hometown. Their camp was at the spot that had rice paddies as far as the eye could see on one side, and on the other side it was all jungles and mountains. Well, when Bob got there, he realized that the squad he just joined was ambushed the week before, and all the senior guys were killed or seriously injured. So the most senior person in his new squad had only been there for about 6 weeks, and that senior person was this kid that just turned 19 years old. Say what now? Can you imagine how terrifying that would be? Bob learned all this, and he went off to the side of their camp to this little spot where he sat down and looked at the valley below. The sun was shining, and there was a warm breeze, not a cloud in the sky. It was a beautiful day, like a postcard from a vacation. So as he's sitting there, his brain starts processing all this. He is thinking that he's got to do a tour that's 13 months, with no previous combat experience, in a squad where all the senior soldiers were just killed. And on top of that, the most experienced person on his team is a teenager kid that's only been there for a handful of weeks. If you follow those breadcrumbs, they don't lead anywhere good. Bob asked himself, now how the hell am I going to survive this? He didn't need a PhD to know that he was in a bad situation. He started having a legitimate panic attack. He was short of breath, his heart was beating out of his chest, and his anxiety went through the roof. That's when he had this crazy realization. He became very aware that he was gonna die there. And then, a really weird thing happened. This calmness came over him. He accepted this reality, and his anxiety went away, and he felt at peace with the whole situation. He was only with the squad for 4 hours when he saw his first face-to-face combat. This went on for several weeks. Bob was in firefights and all sorts of crazy combat situations. And a month later, he was walking in the rice paddies and he hit a tripwire that caused a grenade to go off right beside him. The explosion blew the clothes right off his body. He took shrapnel in his legs and his elbow got so messed up that the joint was poking out of his skin. He was medevaced to Japan, and he recovered at a hospital for a few months before being sent back to do intelligence missions for the rest of his tour. After Bob came back to the US, he was a different person. He suffered serious PTSD, he had flash tempers, the whole 9 yards. Like he'd be at the grocery store picking up a box of Triscuits and just start bawling his eyes out all of a sudden. So there were obvious bad things about that, but it also contributed some positive things as well. One of the ways he could deal with this trauma was to bury himself in work. So after getting back onto US soil, he started working like an absolute savage. That way his mind was always occupied and it couldn't take time to process what he went through during the war. Typical guy mentality, right? Oh, can't let these feelings show, gotta push them deep down. To add to this, he also had the discipline he learned from the Marines, and that made a big difference as well. After working at a steel mill for a year, he went to college and studied accounting. Now, before he joined the Marines, he failed all school subjects except for gym. With this new discipline, he ended up graduating with honors. This is coming from a guy that failed the 5th grade and barely passed high school. Clearly, the stuff he learned in the Army gave him new tools and systems for accomplishing things. After graduating from college, he went off to work in a few different accounting jobs. Now, fast forward several years. He was on a business trip and waiting for a delayed flight, so he just happened to pick up a book on computer programming while waiting. He read that book cover to cover and saw the huge potential of using computers. This was the late 70s, early 80s, so computers were just starting to enter the mainstream. Bob didn't know how to program at all, but he used his new discipline to teach himself how to do it. Anytime he had a complicated problem to solve at work, he'd write a computer program to solve it instead of doing it with paper and pencil. Back then, people didn't have Excel. If they had to do any financial modeling, they'd have to do it all by hand. And Bob saw this as a huge opportunity, so he founded Parsons Technology when he was 36 years old. He was working full-time as an accountant, and he started this business on the side. His plan was to create and sell software. And one of the products that he developed was called Money Counts, which was a home accounting program. Well, he invested $15,000 into this venture in the first year, and it was a total flop. He could barely sell any copies. His original price was $130. Then he dropped it to $99 and it still wasn't selling. He even dropped the price to $69 and still nothing. And this whole time he's burning through his savings to fund the business. He was getting so desperate that he even tried to do some multi-level marketing scheme to sell the product, but nothing seemed to work. Now the software was really good, and he provided great customer service, but he just wasn't able to get past that point of critical mass where the business starts to pick up momentum and grow on its own. By his 3rd year in business, he'd invested something like $40,000 of his personal money into it, and the business was basically broke. Things were not looking good. His sales were low and he was burning through cash. The thing is, up to that point, he had always paid his bills on time, which meant none of his vendors knew that he was in a bad financial situation. Now, what happened then is he got this interesting call from a computer magazine. The editor called him up and said that they had an offer for the first page of the magazine. Another company had bought the ad, but they pulled out at the last minute. The magazine offered Bob a huge discount if he could get an ad ready in time. Now, he didn't have any money, but he knew that this was his lucky break. The ad normally cost around $17,000, and they gave him a huge discount. They offered it to him for $5,000 if he could get the ad layout done in a few days. Bob had a sense that the odds were in his favor. If the ad did well, he'd sell enough software to pay for it. If it didn't do well, he'd probably go out of business. But that's the trajectory he was on anyway, so this was a good Hail Mary last-ditch effort. He signed the deal for the ad. Bob cut the price of his software down to $12. That was insanely cheap compared to his previous prices and compared to all his competitors. The ad went live, and it was a massive hit. People were buying his software like crazy. His mailbox was getting stuffed with orders. He made enough money to pay for the ad, and he reinvested the rest right back into the business. Bob realized that was the winning formula at the time, to do big ads that cost a lot of money instead of doing little ads. That was the key for him to sell his software at scale. That was a critical moment in the business that helped him build serious momentum. A year later, he was able to quit his 9-to-5 accounting job and he started working on the business full-time. Kinda crazy that it took him 4 years of insanely hard work until he could quit his office job. He was in his late 30s at this point. Now, to give you a flavor of just how hard Bob would work, this guy would sometimes work 60 hours straight. Like starting on Monday morning and working through the night on Monday and through the night on Tuesday. By Wednesday night, he'd start to hallucinate and finally have to get some rest. This guy had such an insane work ethic that he was hospitalized twice for exhaustion. He would just work himself to the bone. Hats off to the guy, but other less fortunate fellas in that situation probably got a heart attack and never made it on the Forbes list. So maybe not the best long-term strategy. Anyway, when you put in work like that, you get lots of advantages over your competitors. His dad would always tell him, if you love something, it will tell you its secrets. What he meant by that is if you're passionate about what you do, and you love it, and you obsess about it, then you're going to know intricacies of whatever you're doing that other people won't find out. Bob applied that to his business and he really knew it inside out. Fast forward 10 years after he started the company, and Intuit gave him an offer to buy him out. They offered to buy Parsons Technology for $64 million. At the time of the sale, the company had 1,000 employees, $100 million in annual revenues, and 3 million customers. And it only took Bob a decade to build up that massive success. He was 45 years old and he could retire comfortably. Alright, he got that huge payday, and he also had a 1-year non-compete clause signed, which meant that he couldn't just go and start another company. So he traveled and played golf for a year, but he was just itching to get back into business. And it wasn't about the money, he just loved creating something new and seeing it grow. He also had his first divorce around that time, and that cut his $64 million in half. Okay, he wanted to do something in technology, so he brought together 30 people and started a company that would eventually become GoDaddy. The crazy thing is that when he started this, he didn't really know what he wanted to do. Early on, they'd pursue different online stuff, and their plan was to see what worked and to keep doing that and build a business around it. Unfortunately, nothing was working. They tried education, networks, and website development, and nothing really made a good profit or seemed like a good business model. To make things worse, they were burning through tons of cash, and Bob was funding this whole venture with the money he got from the sale of his first company. After failing at a bunch of projects, they eventually got into the domain registering business. Domain registering is just when you pay a company to buy a domain name. And the way website domain names work is you register the domain name from a registrar and you pay them $10 a year for the right to use that domain name. Well, back then, Bob dealt with another domain company, and he found them to be terrible to deal with. They had the worst customer service, and on top of that, their service was super expensive, so he sussed out an opportunity. His strategy was to offer a much cheaper service. I'm talking under $10 compared to the hundreds of dollars that other companies were charging. Even though this was a good idea, and it was starting to look like it might work, at that point he had already burned through tens of millions of dollars of his own cash. He was down to his last $6 million. Now you gotta remember that he was 50 years old now and he was starting to get worried about running out of money. Going broke and giving up that corner office lifestyle would not be easy. So he went on a trip to Hawaii for a week to clear his head and figure things out. It was a really stressful time for him. If he lost all his money, it would be tricky to make it back. You know, in life, how sometimes you have something minor happen that doesn't seem all that important, but it actually has a profound effect on you? Well, while he was in Hawaii, he basically convinced himself that he'll shut down GoDaddy and fire all his staff when he got back so that he could save his last $6 million. That was his mindset when this weird thing happened. He got to talking to this one valet guy that was parking his car. The valet was Bob's age, and he was parking cars for a living, but he was also ridiculously happy. The valet had this legit joy that just radiated outwards. I'm sure you've met one of these people that just smiles no matter what terrible situation they're in. And he wasn't delusional about it. The guy just had positivity and a love for life. The contrast was too funny. Here's Bob, anxious, miserable, and worried, and he's got $6 million in the bank. And here's a valet working for minimum wage and he's happy as a clam. That one moment reframed his thinking completely. He basically decided that he's gonna go all in on GoDaddy, and if he went bankrupt, so be it. He'd find a job doing something else. For all he cared, he'd become a Walmart greeter, telling people about the Pop-Tart sale in aisle 5. Bob flew back, determined to keep on grinding things out with GoDaddy come hell or high water. This was high-stakes stuff. Well, one important thing to note is that around this time is when the dot-com bubble was bursting. This is important because for years, Bob couldn't access as much advertising as he wanted. The reason was he had to compete with other companies that were raising tons of cash in the stock market, and these same companies were paying insane amounts of dollars for acquiring customers. Like a competitor would pay $200 on an ad to get a customer that would bring in $15 of profit. The reason these companies could do that is because the dot-com bubble was underway and they could sell their stock for insane amounts of money on the stock markets. That meant that these companies had massive ad budgets, so they could do this sort of thing. Now, of course, that sort of business model is not sustainable. It made no business sense, and Bob couldn't do that because he was self-funding GoDaddy and it wasn't a public company. He couldn't just sell stock to raise cash. And besides, that type of strategy could easily blow up long term. This meant that advertisers didn't want to work with him because his budgets were tiny compared to these big spender tech companies. Bob was very frugal in his business. He was a hardcore value guy. Well, fast forward a little bit, and once the dot-com crash was underway, all of a sudden these high-flying tech companies were screwed because their business models were bunk. And a lot of them went out of business very quickly. This meant that all of a sudden, advertisers wanted to work with Bob and offered him huge discounts because no one else was paying for ads. It was like a glass of water after a handful of salt. It was a crazy turn of events that allowed him to grow GoDaddy and take market share. The dot-com bust wiped out a bunch of high-flying technology companies, but it also allowed the frugal, business-savvy tech companies to survive. GoDaddy and Amazon are great examples of that. A handful of months after Bob was going to pull the plug on GoDaddy, the business finally became profitable. Imagine how close he was to quitting before the business became successful. There's an Asian saying that goes something like, "The desire to quit is greatest when you're closest to success." Well, that's a perfect real-life example of that. 10 years after Bob started GoDaddy, they had 16% market share of the domain business. That was a good amount, but they wanted to grow even more. So he hired a market research firm. They did a big research project and said that the reason his company is not growing is because he was only advertising online and he wasn't using traditional media. He was missing a whole lot of people by only advertising online. Well, one thing led to another, and Bob got the idea to do a Super Bowl ad. Back then, they cost a little over $2 million. The challenge with a Super Bowl ad is when it comes on, most people are at their buddy's place, they've been drinking, and they're stuffing their face with mozzarella sticks while bumping beer bellies. So they don't really pay attention to the ad unless it's something that's very unique and different and something that just draws your attention in. The ad had to have a shock factor to get everyone to pay attention. So they decided on doing this really edgy TV spot that had an attractive model with a wardrobe malfunction. Of course, this was on cable, so you couldn't really see any nudity, but it was still going to be very risque, you can imagine. Bob wanted to get everyone's attention and to get people talking. He booked 2 ad spots in the Super Bowl, and he got all this in writing and signed all the contracts. Then the game came on, the first ad showed, and the TV network immediately got so many complaints that they pulled the second ad. That's something that's never been done before. No ad had ever been canceled last minute like that. And it caused this massive media story, which was a ton of free publicity for GoDaddy. Their market share went from 16 to 25% in a week, and it stayed there. The TV network ended up settling with Bob. He never paid for the second ad, and he even got his money back for the first ad. Somehow this guy went 2 for 2. Incredible! That TV spot did so well that GoDaddy kept using that same strategy, and less than 10 years later, their market share in North America went from 16 to almost 70%. Alright, with all this business success, you can imagine that Bob was making money hand over fist. Well, 14 years after starting GoDaddy, he sold a majority stake to a bunch of private equity firms in a deal that valued the company at $2.3 billion. Bob was officially a billionaire. Alright, Vision Nation, that wraps it up for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please share it with a friend, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have an amazing day. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions. Before making any decisions, consult a professional. I may maintain positions in the securities discussed on this podcast. This show is copyrighted by the Wall Street Vision. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.